Why, hello, my loves, and welcome back to Spook Manor. Are you here for a terrifying tale you could lose your head about? Then join me as we follow a young woman down the road to hell, which is ironically paved in good intentions. Julia is a young 19-year-old woman with far too much patience, at least most of the time anyway. It is a virtue she had learned growing up, being that she has an older sister who suffers with severe anxiety, a chronic obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a temper with a short fuse. The sisters came from a tight-knit family that always looked out for each other in their time of need, and this warm August night in Delaware is no exception. Her sister Maggie had just gone through an intense surgery and had asked Julia to care for her little dog for several days while she recovered. Though hoping Maggie would take the much-needed time to heal, Julia wasn't surprised at all to get a frantic call the very night she returned home from the hospital. It was midnight, and Julia was not seeing the urgency in her sister's demands. She wanted the dog back, and she wanted the little corgi Pebbles, right now. Sure, it was only a 17-minute drive if she went through Woodland, and Julia had always given in to her sister's needs out of respect for her condition in the past. This time, however, her patience was growing thin. But as little Pebbles barked incessantly every time her phone rang, she felt she had no choice, despite her better judgment about going out this late at night by herself. After refusing several times, 10 calls later, and a desperate plea from Maggie's husband, Julia finally agreed to make the late-night drive. The night was bright, and the blue moon shone down on the forest that lined Woodland Church Road. Julia was grateful for the great visibility as she rounded each curve. Pebbles was keeping to himself in the passenger seat, and she danced happily to the beat of her favorite song while she downed a container of coffee. As she rounded a slight corner over a small bridge, her car unexpectedly shifted gears, causing the vehicle to jerk hard and then shut off completely. Julia cursed loudly as the hot liquid coated her white t-shirt, and little Pebbles let out a few barks just to add a little more tension to the already uncomfortable circumstance. After 3 failed attempts to restart the car, Julia then decided to step out and check the engine. She popped the hood and leaned over. Though she felt a blast of heat from the motor, an unexpected chill filled the air. The little hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she became aware of the silence that surrounded her. The trees stood eerily against the light of the moon as she stared off into the forest. She had a creeping feeling that someone was watching her. She tried to ignore the cold mist that started to swirl around her ankles and creep up her spine. She fought hard against the terrifying thoughts of being hunted down by some lone, crazed man who might be wandering about in the wilderness. And she tried to pretend she wasn't horrified of what wild animal might be lurking just beyond the tree line, watching her every move. But when her cell phone rang, and little Pebbles began to yap like a crazed chihuahua on steroids, she jumped so hard that she banged her head on the hood above her. She knew it was her sister Maggie calling to check in on her, and made a mad dash to the car door. Pulling it open to grab her phone, little Pebbles managed to slip out past her, chasing something down to the water's edge under the bridge. Julia then let out another curse word as she grabbed her phone and turned to run after the little booger. She promptly declined the call as she yelled out to Pebbles to come back. Classic to her sister's way, the phone began to ring again immediately. Julia couldn't hear a thing over the incessant ringing, and knew if she didn't answer, she would never find the little dog. She knew how her sister would react knowing that Pebbles had escaped, and though panicked, she played it cool as she answered the phone, while secretly continuing to search as she listened to the hysteria on the other end. Maggie began her tirade of, "What is taking so long? Where are you? Where is Pebbles?" Though a kind-hearted and loving soul, Julia was no actress, and Maggie began to assume the worst. Reaching both arms out over the bridge to coax the dog to come back, Julia tried desperately to calm her by hollering, "No, Maggie, everything's fine. It's okay. Calm down. Maggie, 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 I have your baby." She cried out before accidentally dropping her phone on the grass as she leaned far over the guardrail. Luckily, the phone appeared undamaged, despite having shut off completely. Julia sat on her knees praying the phone would reboot. Slowly, the screen light came on, and she breathed a sigh of relief. But that relief didn't last long. as she heard a faint sound coming from down the road. Listening hard, it is the sound of a horse and buggy. Julia became hopeful that someone would come and help, and stood up to greet them as they approached, despite the fact that the noise kept coming closer, gradually getting louder and louder as the seconds passed. Nothing ever appeared on the roadway. Julia stared off in confusion as she listened intently to the clapping of horse feet and wheels as it went by. It was then that her phone rang again. She screamed and accidentally threw it in surprise. Still ringing, she grabbed it off the ground, answered it, and pleaded with her sister to let her talk with Maggie's husband. She knew he could help, but Maggie would freak out if she knew what was going on. Her sister refused until Julia let her speak to Pebbles. Realizing she had forgotten about the dog, she quickly ran back to the edge of the bridge and hollered out the dog's name to return. Maggie lit into her, demanding to know where the dog was. Julia again threw her arms out over the edge of the bridge and called out to Pebbles before answering her sister. "Maggie! Maggie! I have your baby!" But just as she finished the last word, it was as though the air had been sucked from her lungs. There were sparkling lights that slowly began to appear, floating over the water and throughout the trees. At first they appeared to be like fireflies, but then they began to grow and emanate a bluish-white light. Some grew to the size of baseballs, and others as large as basketballs. But it was the shadowy figure that began to form which made her body lock up, and she stood frozen as the form moved about in the bright full moonlight. Her sister began to scream into the phone, and Julia almost couldn't respond. Finally, she muttered, Maggie, I have your baby." Time seemed to stand still as Julia recounted the famous legend about this ghost, who coincidentally shared the same name as her troubled sister. Slowly, Julia ended the call with the realization she had unintentionally summoned the spirit. She lowered her arm down by her side, staring at the ghostly sight before her. The shadowy figure began to transform as it approached her from the trees and over the swampy waters below. The form became a ghostly white, transparent woman in Victorian clothing, who held her own decapitated head in her hands. The head called out to Julia in a sad and desperate voice. "Please, reattach my head so that I may come back to life and find my baby. Please, oh please help me." The spirit pleaded, and the headless woman continued to beg as Julia stood there in shock. Suddenly breaking the trance, Pebbles burst out from underneath the bridge. He made a mad dash towards Julia, and adrenaline surged in her veins. Fast as she could manage, Julia scooped up Pebbles in her arms and jumped in the car. Miraculously, the engine revved, and they took off full speed ahead, leaving her ringing cell phone on the desolate roadway behind them. This is certainly not the first time the ghost of poor old Maggie has been seen asking for help. It is said that she was decapitated in a horse and buggy accident on the bridge in the late 1800s. Legend suggests that she was pregnant, or that perhaps the baby was lost in the accident as well. Though we may never truly know the history behind the demise of the child, we do know that Maggie Blacksom's body resides in the local cemetery, and that she will continue to seek help from anyone brave enough to call out to her during the witching hour. Maggie, I have your child. So tell me, my loves, have you been to Old Maggie's Bridge in Delaware? Have you perhaps seen the ghost of the woman herself? Please comment down below and like and subscribe for more fictional stories that are often of actual urban legends and sometimes have historical reference. See you next week and have a good night.